when nobody was traveling anymore.
Sure, and those are changes in business practices that many of us experience, and the kind of the fallout from a legal standpoint is people had their legal relationships disrupted. I think that's a good point that Katie made. I had a couple of cases in the early mid-COVID days back in the spring, early summer, where people who were on quotas or sales commission quotas or certain goals or sales goals, and that maybe some of them were on, these kind of maybe a warning that, hey, if you don't make your goals next quarter, we're going to have to take some action against you. And they didn't make their goals exactly for the reason Katie said. They couldn't travel, they couldn't make presentations, and the axis fell on them from an employment standpoint. So they lost their jobs because of COVID, because they couldn't meet their quotas, meet their goals, meet their commission goals. So that stuff happened, and I saw a fair amount of it. Uh, what I'm seeing now in some of my work is kind of go fast forward. The latest iteration of some of the COVID legal issues are the lockdown shutdowns caused by in restaurants, bars, hospitality facilities. And we've all read about those, the restaurants and bars that challenged the governor's closure orders. This basically started happening around Thanksgiving. In we all lived through the various closure orders, and they were lifted and they were reinstated. But on November 18th, the governor imposed reimposed the original lockdown for March. And as a result of that, all bars, restaurants were closed except for takeout and pickups and things like that from November on. And as we read about, many facilities around the state, knowing that, I mean, they were already hurting significantly, as many of us are, because of what happened before. But during that holiday season, it was just devastating because that's where most of it, not most, but a great portion of their income comes during that holiday season for business gatherings, conferences, but just people coming into restaurants and bars. It was quite devastating. So we read about, and we saw about a number of businesses, both locally and around the state, especially the smaller ones, smaller family-owned businesses, bars, restaurants, opened. And the governor and his minions swooped in on them and threw all kinds of legal paperwork at them and sued them in many different venues. And those cases are still going on. I happen to be involved in a number of them, and I'm not here to argue the merits of those cases, but they've been the governor's authority to have that kind of sweeping lockdown has been challenged in the courts. Many of these facilities and bars and restaurants were ordered closed by even after the governor lifted the restrictions in mid-December. The restrictions were lifted a bit, and they allowed outdoor dining. Well, not necessarily that conducive here in Minnesota. And then finally, in early January, as you know, some of the restrictions were lifted back to capacity limits, 50% capacity, and so on and so forth. But it was during that key period from mid-November through the New Year's where these businesses were required to be locked down. A number of them didn't lock down. The result was a number of lawsuits, injunctions, fines were imposed. A couple of places were held in contempt of court for refusing to abide by a court order directing them to comply with the governor's order. And some of those cases, and suspensions of their liquor license and food license, and some of those cases are still going on, even though the restrictions have been relaxed, although not lifted. There's a major case coming on in mid-February before the Minnesota Supreme Court, Minnesota Court of Appeals, I'm sorry, that addresses the legitimacy of the governor's orders. And it's being challenged on a number of grounds. First of all, that the governor didn't have the legal authority to enter that kind of draconian order, types of orders. There's also some constitutional issues as to why certain facilities were closed down and others weren't. Tattoo parlors were open, restaurants were closed, but some restaurants were allowed to be open. The governor's order allowed restaurants to be open at the airport, in private cafeterias, private facilities, and schools, to the extent schools are open, but required commercial facilities to shut down. So there's arguments that it's unfair and violation of various constitutional requirements. And all those cases, not all of them, but a number of them are still, as I said, circulating through the court system. And in mid-February, the Minnesota Court of Appeals is going to hear one of the bigger cases that involves a coalition of these restaurants and bars that are challenging the governor's order. So kind of watch for that. It's from the people who are the legal savants who are observing those cases have kind of come to the view that that the challengers are probably going to lose because their record right now is about 0 for everything. They've got about the same, the bars and restaurants who have challenged the governor's order so far have about the same, in court, they have about the same win-loss record as Rudy Giuliani has. Okay? They've lost about 40, not 40, but about 30 of these cases. So they've won a couple, but the record is not very good. However, in some other states, the courts have ruled that the governor's sweeping shutdown and lockdown orders are illegal or unconstitutional. In New York, that's happened. In Wisconsin, it's happened. And we see a whole dichotomy in Wisconsin, as we've read. In Wisconsin, the legislature is about to lift the mask requirement imposed by the governor. So it looks like if you're living in Superior, Wisconsin, you don't have to wear a mask, and if you're living in Hudson, Wisconsin, you don't have to wear a mask. But in Minnesota, if you cross the river in Minnesota, you do. So there's dichotomies from state to state. That's not that unusual, but there doesn't seem to be a unified national approach to the issues of lockdowns and shutdowns attributable to COVID. Some other kind of COVID-related issues that have come up too is that I've dealt with are return to work issues. And again, this was a more significant issue in early and mid-COVID days. By that, I mean spring, summer, and even into the early fall. It's not much of an issue now because so many of these cases have been going through the legal system. And the issue arises when an employee says, I don't want to work here, and I don't want to work here right now because it's unsafe. And I'm not comfortable coming into work because we're not imposing masks, we're not imposing social distancing or whatever. So the employee takes it on their own. Sometimes a group of employees say, we won't work until the safety conditions are uplifted. And the question is, well, can the employees do that? Well, they can do it, but do they risk their jobs by doing that? Does their refusal to work because of perceived safety violations justify the employer saying, okay, fine, you don't have to come into work, or we don't have to pay you. Thank you very much. And that clash has played out in a number of cases. Some have gone to court, some haven't gone to court. I've been involved in a few of those. And early on in the early COVID days, from March through about summertime, the employees were losing those cases. The courts, not a lot of them went through the court system because the courts were pretty locked up too. But to the extent that they argued these cases, either in unemployment cases or in other forums, even before OSHA, generally the view was that employees who refused to work because of perceived safety conditions had put their job at risk. As COVID became a more pronounced feature, and as the situation became more prevalent, and the law started to shift. And what happened, and the tribunal, the decision makers, at least from a legal standpoint, were saying, okay, we're going to cut you some slack. And if you have legitimate safety concerns, you do not have to go to work. The employer can't fire you because of that. And if you do decide to leave the workplace, if you decide to quit because of the safety conditions, in some instances, people who lost their jobs because of COVID were denied unemployment benefits. In some states, in some cases, they weren't. It was a mixture. It was hard to predict who would be entitled to unemployment compensation or not, because if they lost their job either because of COVID or, more significantly, because they refused to go to work because of COVID safety concerns. The Biden administration, one of its many executive orders that we've been reading about, this was kind of tucked away. Well, it didn't get a lot of attention among those 36 executive orders that the president has entered in his first week. But one of the directives was that if people are unwilling to work because of safety conditions, or because they can't work because their kids aren't in school and they have to stay home to help them with remote learning or help be a caretaker to somebody who's sick with COVID. In other words, if a person's inability to work is any way related to COVID, the Biden administration has directed that they be entitled to unemployment compensation. In the past, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some were, some weren't. There was no consistency. The Biden administration's directive is to allow those people to be entitled to unemployment compensation if you're not working because of a COVID-related matter. It's a legitimate matter. Okay, that's the Biden directive. However, unemployment, as most of us know, is administered. It's federally funded in part. Part of the funding comes from the feds, but it's mainly administered by states, and the states don't have to necessarily abide by the president's directive because they administer the system. So I suspect we're going to kind of see a red-blue divide on that. Many states will abide by that and say that makes sense. We're going to allow people to get unemployment benefits if their jobs are COVID related, if their jobs are lost because of COVID related concerns. And some states will say, no, we're not going to do that. You've got to show up at work. So that's an unresolved issue that'll probably vary from state to state. I suspect Minnesota will be on the side of allowing people to have unemployment compensation benefits if they're COVID related concerns. Another matter that's kind of fallen by the wayside, but was kind of a big issue a few months ago, was the issue of immunity for employers. Remember, as they were debating the initial stimulus bill and even the second stimulus bill in Congress, the Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, who then was the majority leader, tied any kind of significant COVID relief to a provision that would give businesses immunity from any kind of lawsuits related to COVID. And I'm not here to say whether that's a good idea or a bad idea to take a political stance, but it certainly was an issue back in September, October, November, and it really held up the COVID relief measures. The Democrats were adamantly opposed to that in part because of their labor union support and because they felt that it put workers at risk. But the McConnell proposal was that as a condition for COVID relief, businesses would get some type of, it never was really clear what it was, but some type of immunity so they couldn't be sued for COVID related issues, not mainly by employees. That was the main issue, but it also would have applied to customers or anyone who encountered a COVID affliction because of their contact or interaction with people in a business setting. That was a big hang up for a number of months, and it did delay the second stimulus bill. However, it's no longer on the table anymore. Well, I shouldn't say it's no longer on the table. It's probably under the table, but you don't hear much about it now because the Republicans aren't in the majority in the Senate, and that's no longer a sticking point that's preventing COVID relief. The new Biden stimulus proposal. There's other impediments to that, but the notion that there has to be some kind of quid pro quo, that in order to get COVID relief, businesses have to be given some type of immunity from lawsuits, is now no longer a significant obstacle to passing COVID relief. I'll talk a little bit about vaccines. It's an issue I've confronted a bit. One of the legal employment issues that comes up, and maybe the preeminent one with respect to vaccines, is what about those people who don't want to be vaccinated? Again, that was a bigger issue a few months ago. As we're seeing in public opinion polls and surveys, more and more people are climbing on the vaccination bandwagon. In fact, they're trying to climb on it. Let's put it that way. But initially, if you'll recall, before the actual vaccines were pronounced to be safe, some of these polls were saying, well, 60-40, and a third of the public won't take it, doesn't want a vaccine. And there was a racial divide on that too, as we all know. The antipathy to being vaccinated was much higher among people of color for very understandable historic and social reasons. Those polls now are showing much, now that there's actual vaccines out there and they're being administered, people are clamoring to say, hey, I want to get in the front of the line here. So the latest survey I've seen, or poll, which is worth whatever polls are worth these days, was that as initially there were 30 to 40% of people who were resistant to the concept of being vaccinated. It's now in the 10 to 15% category. And I suspect as they see other people getting vaccinated without having any significant side effects, if that happens, that number is going to shrink to a real small number. But there still are anti-vaccination people. They're out there. And the question is what to do about them from a legal standpoint. Well, I've dealt with that on a couple of occasions. It arises when the employer mandates that an employee be vaccinated, and the employer refuses to do so. It's come up in the past in connection with flu vaccinations, and that's kind of the predecessor for obviously the COVID issue. And the law basically is if an employee refuses to be if an employer has a policy requiring somebody to be vaccinated, and the employer applies that even-handedly, not discriminatorily, not targeting, well, you don't have to be, but you have to be. If it's across the board, with some possible exception, and the employee refuses to participate in an employer-required vaccination program or be able to certify, the employer will say, you have to work here, you have to be certified that you've been vaccinated. If the employer refuses, the employee can be fired. The employer can say, well, if you won't abide by this policy and you're posing a risk to other people, both co-workers and vendors and customers and other people on the premises, we can't allow you to work here. So they're at risk of losing their jobs, and then they're at risk of losing unemployment and all those other things I just talked about. And I've had those kind of cases in the past. They've been flu cases, not vaccine cases yet, because we haven't seen that develop much yet, although I've had one vaccine case. And the issue then becomes, does the employee have a right not to be vaccinated? Well, yes, they don't have to be vaccinated. But the question is, okay, if they exercise that right, what happens to them? Do they lose their job? Do they put their job at risk? And as I said, the answer generally has been, up to now, this might change, but the answer generally has been yes. An employer can terminate an employee for failure to vaccinate. However, there are two major exceptions to that, and I've been involved in cases concerning these exceptions in the past and probably prospectively with the COVID vaccination. If an employee has legitimate religious-related reasons for refusing to be vaccinated, then they're entitled under the civil rights laws to not be vaccinated, and they can't be fired because they have a religious objection. Now, it has to be legitimate. That doesn't mean the religion has to be legitimate, but the objection has to be based on some legitimate reason. I had one case that played this out. My client had some religious objections to having a flu vaccination this summer. This is post-COVID, but pre-vaccination. But the employer said everyone has to have a flu vaccination here, and she refused to do it. And she had some religious objection, and the employer initially turned her down, and then I helped her develop. I said, well, just saying you don't like it because you don't do it because of religious reasons is enough. You have to show what your religious reason is. And she did. She said, well, what's your basis? She said, well, it's my religious views. I said, what are your religious views? I'm not going to judge your religious views, but you got to tell us what they are so we know what they are. So I said, are there things are there particular treatises or scriptures that you're relying on? And then she said, well, yeah. I said, why don't you find them and show them to me? So she went back and picked out from her particular religious tract 10 particular phrases that she construed to be a religious reason to refuse vaccination. And we put that together in a little memorandum and gave it to the employer and said, look, she has some legitimate reasons. We're not going to judge the validity of those reasons. We're not here to assess the quality of her religiosity. But if she has these concerns, you have to employ her. And if you don't, you're discriminating against her because of her religion. And in two cases like that, the employers backed off because in both cases, the employees came forward, were able to cite certain things of a religious nature that justified their position. Again, I didn't get into, and the employers didn't get into assessing the quality of those beliefs or whether their beliefs are correct or not. But the fact is that she had them, and that's all that counts. So that's one way for an employee to obviate a vaccination requirement. A second exception to the vaccination requirement is that if there's a medical risk posed to the employee. If the employee can show that there's some medical reason why he or she does not want to be vaccinated, then the employer has to honor that reason if it's legitimate. Because if the employer fails to honor a medical request to be exempted from vaccination, that's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Family Medical Leave Act and all the health-related laws that employers can't discriminate based on someone's health. It's extremely difficult, I have found, to find medical people who will certify that an employee for medical reasons shouldn't be vaccinated. Although there's some people who have conditions. We know that there's some people who shouldn't be vaccinated because of their medical conditions. But the harder cases are ones where there's no provable physiological condition that would warrant avoiding the vaccine. But there's another way that an employee can assert that kind of claim on medical grounds, and that's mental stress. And I've had a couple cases where I've suggested to my clients that if this is really causing mental stress and emotional distress and bothering you a great deal, if a legitimate medical provider, like a psychologist or a therapist or even a social worker, will legitimize that, and we present that to your employer with a statement from a medical provider that this is causing anguish and stress and emotional distress, that you're getting a vaccination would cause emotional distress, then the employer
Marshall?
asks, yes.
I have a couple of questions about employers and stress and things. And
Sure, go ahead. I don't know who's asking them.
Well, I wanted to, get
Who's
some
saying?
of the questions before we have to leave.
Who's talking here?
This is Gary.
Oh, I'm sorry, Gary. I'm sorry. You're up in the, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, please. I just didn't know who's talking.
Basically, there's privacy issues. There's, we're talking about maybe we have to carry a certificate that we got vaccinated. We're talking about, these applications that track you about you've been exposed.
Yeah.
What do you see there? Where's that going?
Well, yeah, I think it's a good point. Those privacy concerns relating health matters are always, not always, but they're often prevalent in the workplace. Gary's particularly sensitive to that because of his business, and he ought to be. And I think they're going to be more pronounced. I think there'll be more concerns about that. If employees have to come forward with medical excuses or medical reasons, I shouldn't say excuses, medical reasons for not being vaccinated, and they have to submit it to an employer, and the employer perhaps has to have someone in human resources look at. I guess the general privacy and confidentiality concerns would be the same with any other condition. I just think we're going to see more of it. It's going to be more pronounced. And then you're going to have a potential problem with that being just passed around in the workplace. Someone will say, hey, I heard so-and-so wasn't vaccinated. How come he's able to work here and I'm not? Or I won't be vaccinated because she wasn't vaccinated. Well, how did they find out about that? Well, word of mouth, and that kind of information travels fairly rapidly in the workplace. So I think employers need to be particularly vigilant and wary about protecting, to the extent they can, the privacy and confidentiality of these medical concerns. There are, as we all know, federal and state laws that can be quite draconian in imposing fines and other liability on employers who give out or allowed to give out medical information, either in the workplace or outside the workplace. So it's a good point, and I think as for people in management positions, they probably ought to take a look at what their policy is and their actual operation of that policy and how they protect and preserve medical confidentiality and privacy of medical records, which is be more pronounced. As I was saying, though, the way to, from an employee standpoint, the way to pursue that is to get a statement, a certification, a statement, a report from a legitimate practitioner who points out the mental stress that this would impose on the employee. One case that I had, I'll give you an example. This was a client of mine who resisted having the flu vaccination. Again, this was in the September of this year, not pre-COVID vaccination, but flu vaccination. But the same issue is going to arise with the COVID too. And the reason that she was opposed to that, she had a pretty responsible job at a fairly well-known institution in our community. And she had a significant job. She was, fairly high in the pecking order, not at the top, but she was a high middle management. And she had a good job and a good salary, but she wouldn't get a flu vaccination. And the reason that she had, again, her reason was that her sister, as a young child, had been vaccinated and had a terrible reaction, got real sick, and it was a real terrible reaction that her sister had, not her, but her sister. This happened some 20 years ago, but it has stayed with her in her mind, and it just freaks her out, to use a technical medical term. It freaks her out to even think about being vaccinated. And so I suggested that if she can verify that through a mental health provider, she probably can avoid having to be vaccinated. And that's exactly the way it worked out. The employer wasn't real happy about that, but it's the way it worked out, and she's still working there. And I guess everything's working out.
I know we're getting close to your hard stop, so I want to have at least a minute or two of maybe of a few brief questions. If
I was just about wrapping up. I was looking at this from the employee standpoint, but obviously many of you are in management and employers. I think you have to look at the other standpoint too. I've been talking about the employee rights. Okay, what are the employer obligations? Well, the employer obligations are kind of the converse of the employee rights. If the employees have these rights, then management has to abide by them. And I would just point out to be very careful and wary from a management standpoint of refusing or denying certain of these benefits to employees in connection with vaccines or safe workplaces. because if you do, there's a potential exists that the employee can bring some kind of legal action, either through the Department of Human Rights for discrimination or some kind of lawsuit. So it's kind of a two-edged sword for both employees and employers in many of these areas. So that's kind of an overview of some of the issues that I've seen and that are developing. And as I indicated, they're evolving, they're morphing. We're probably going to see some different COVID-related issues from a legal business standpoint as the year progresses. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of give you this overview. I hope it's a little bit helpful. I suspect most of you have experienced some of this either personally or professionally. So I'll be happy to try to entertain some questions. I don't know if I have the answers, but I'll certainly listen to the questions.
Questions, anybody?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Marshall. That was very informative. Appreciate it. Thomas Johansson, obviously, as my name said, but I'll just say it in case anyone.
I see it.
Yeah. So I have a lot of friends that are business owners, actually my brother as well, and clients that I work with. I'm a loan originator, and that have had issues with basically their leases. One of the biggest issues, of course, you had talked a lot about the cost of employees and employers putting pressure on wanting to get rid of employees when they shouldn't potentially. But of course, long-term leases for businesses is a very normal practice. And the commercial real estate business, I also have friends that work on the other side. It just seems like the government has generally almost completely, if not completely, ignored this major aspect of our economy. And I'm curious what your perspective or maybe experience has been as it pertains to that challenge where, how can a bar or restaurant pay their rent potentially if they are only in person? Some of these businesses don't have takeaway.
And I represent a lot of employees. I also am representing some of those bars and restaurants in the litigation I mentioned. So I'm representing some businesses who are being hit hard by those issues, Thomas. And it also that relates to an issue I probably should touch on, is the moratorium, the rent and mortgage moratorium. That's another issue that's really being visited upon owners of businesses or owners of property. And I've had a couple of those kind of cases where I have one case where my client owns a few residential rental properties. He's not a big, he has other business, but he has a couple of residential real estate properties, and he wanted to move in his children into one of his houses, but he's got a tenant in there and he can't get rid of the tenant because of the moratorium. So there's a problem there where his kids are going to live and how he can deal with the moratorium. The moratoriums are a huge problem for landlords, and I suspect many people here have recognized that. I happen to be a landlord myself. I have one piece of residential rental property, but fortunately, knock on wood, my tenant is hung in there and we haven't had any problems. But I can certainly, I suspect some of you have experienced that problem either personally, professionally, with ownership of real estate, and the tenants either aren't paying or can't pay or won't pay, and they're going to, I think, by the time that the moratorium is lifted, and I guess the latest moratorium has now been extended, at least the federal level, through September. By the time the moratorium is lifted, there's going to be a huge amount of unpaid rent, and they're not going to be able to collect that rent. So that's from the landlord standpoint. But again, your question, kind of, Thomas, is directed a little bit to the commercial lessee and and the fact that they can't pay their rent because their businesses are half closed down or they can only work at 50% capacity. Obviously that trickles down. They lay off employees. The employees can't pay their rent. So it's a real problem. But I agree with you that the most governmental action and attention these days has been directed at the employee level and at the renter lessee level, and much less attention directed at the people who own the property or run the property or lease the property out. I guess some of the relief comes through the PPP and the stimulus payments, but it's a real problem and it's hard to balance. So anyone want to relate any kind of a particular experience on the rental issue, either from a standpoint of the renter or the rentee?
I'm getting concerned, Marshall, because you need a hard stop at 9:10 for your court
that's
case.
My time. Okay.
Yeah.
I can take one more. I can take one more question if anyone has their observation.
Okay. One more question. Anybody have one more question? Yeah, it looks like we're good with the questions, but I'm going to say that, Marshall, with this topic. But does somebody have a question?
Oh, Marshall, hi. This is Al Swintek. I'm with Centerpoint Energy.
Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. My question, Gary kind of alluded to it, but we've got people that are out in the field working every day, and and we've had very good success trying to avoid, for the most part, problems, people getting sick. But sometimes people test positive, and then sometimes we've got people that need to be quarantined because they've been by someone who tested positive. So my question had to do with the apps that are being pushed out on people's iPhones and whatnot. We haven't experienced this yet, but I'm just thinking, if all of a sudden you got a notice on your iPhone that said, oh, you were near someone while you were at the grocery store, and so just FYI, you may have been exposed. Right now we wouldn't know that because we never received that notification, but all of a sudden, if that notification pops up on your phone, you're like, whoa, what should I do here? So have you heard about that or thought about it? What are your thoughts around it?
Well, both. From an employee standpoint, one might counsel an employee, one might advise an employee not to tell their employer about that necessarily, because it might put them at risk. But if they, on the other hand, that may be socially irresponsible as well. But from an employee standpoint, they might not want to notify their employer about that, because if they do, they might run some risk. But the other problem from the employer standpoint, your kind of standpoint, the management standpoint, you probably ought to, it would be wise to have a policy, and you probably have one, that employees have to notify their employers if they have reason to believe that they've been in contact with someone, or if they've tested positive for any of those features, because the employers aren't necessarily going to know. So, and if they don't know, then they can't obviously take any action. But I think it's wise for employers to have a policy that they notify their employees and put it in writing. Here's our policies with respect to COVID issues. If you test positive, you have to tell us within 24 hours or tell us immediately. If you're in contact with someone who tested positive, if you're in a situation that you ought to be quarantined, you've got to tell us. Because I imagine, folks, there's a lot of people out there who are under those situations, tested positive, quarantined, been in contact, and they're coming into work anyway because they, first of all, need to work. And if they don't come into work, they're not going to get paid, or they're afraid of losing their jobs or other reasons. And the employers don't have no reason to know that, right, Al? I mean, that's the problem. So at a minimum, the employers ought to have a policy on that. Whether the policy is enforceable and remains to be seen, but they ought to at least have a policy and say these are our expectations. And if someone doesn't do it, if they don't follow the policy, then they're subject to a job disciplinary action.
Okay. Well,
good question. Thank you all. I hope I shed a little bit of light on some of these issues that you've confronted. It's an evolving issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you very much. We'll definitely have to have you back later, as this is constantly going to be an evolving issue for employers and employees, obviously. And I think we just scratched just a little bit of it. There's no question about that. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you're successful in court, and unless you're against me. And you have a good day now. And then
thank you, folks. I missed the introductions of everybody. Oh gosh.
Yeah, you know what? The introductions. I'll go real quick for the introduction. Well, no, I guess.
No, I've got to leave. Thank you all for letting me share some time with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Marshall. Yep. Bye now. Okay. So I'm going to call on Maurice and Mark. If you want to give us the city update, we'll move right along as quickly as we can to get caught up here.
I'll go pretty quick. A couple of things. One, State of the City address is coming up on Friday, March 5th. So put on your calendars. It'll be virtual, obviously. Kind of recap what happened the previous year, the city's accomplishments. Also, we're still in process of hiring a new housing economic development manager. I'm sure Mark probably dive in more if he wants to talk about that, because we approved the HRA levy late last year. So we're in the process of hiring that person to help with our efforts with affordable housing and economic development. Mark, anything else to add? I can't think of anything top of my head at the moment.
No, that's great, Maurice. Thanks. I think we'll probably have more to say about the hiring of that position maybe at the next meeting. We just closed on that posting this week. So Maybe a couple other quick things to talk about. We're still in the midst of completing our facilities study. We've done our first round of community engagement. We've done a lot of data collection, met with various stakeholders around the community. And so we are starting to move into what we call the space programming discussion of that, and getting into some more details. And we will be hosting some more community engagement events. So we greatly appreciate any support that any of you can provide in getting the word out, and just letting people know that this important discussion is taking place. This is definitely the result will be a report that will give us a plan forward for our facilities that's both long-term and phased. And so that's an important part of the message. We also have a task force working on our police, potentially new police commission task force. So that is moving along very quickly. I have other things to do. I'm not involved in that one, so I can't say too much about it, but an important effort there on the city's behalf. And then finally, just kind of a acknowledgement to Excel and also I understand now CenterPoint. We are wrapping up the planning phase of our Partners in Energy program that we're working with Excel on, and I understand, Al, that CenterPoint is also now involved in that. So we'll be moving into the implementation phase of that over the next 18 months, starting very shortly. So just a few highlights from Golden Valley.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay,
We have to
Hopkins
run to our
Schools.
meeting, so bye, everyone.
Katie, you ready?
Yeah, sure. Hi, good morning, guys. My updates are going to be pretty quick today because not a lot has changed since the last time we spoke. We have all of our in-person K through 6 back in school as of Monday of this week. Secondary starts to phase back in for 1 day a week starting next week. We did receive some really great updates from our internal teams on pathogen mitigation efforts that have been going on within all of our buildings to support this kind of back to school effort. And if anybody has any questions around that, I know that we have lots of data that I won't even bore you guys with, but the things that the school is doing from a sanitizing and air circulation and ionization perspective is very impressive. And then the board did approve the CFAC recommendations. I had given you guys a little bit of a heads up on that, that it was going to be a pretty tough year for us from a budget perspective. Because of that, we're looking at anywhere between worst case scenario, $4.5 million in budget cuts. If the legislature comes through, perhaps less than that. Due to that, we're starting to plan our community listening sessions, our planning sessions with the executive staff, as well as information sharing. One of the things that we're really striving to do, for better or for worse, is to engage our community in these budget scenarios. Not that we can please everyone, but one of the criticisms that we had received last year was that we weren't open and forthcoming enough with the budget cuts until the time really came to make those decisions. So for those of you that kind of follow the Hopkins schools, I think you'll start to see a lot more communication coming to our families and our educators around that effort. Great.
Thank you.
Sure. I've got to drop, Betsy. I'll hand it off to you. I thank you for your guys' time, but I have to head to another meeting.
Okay, great.
Katie.
Thank you for
Thanks,
your
guys.
participation.
Good morning, everybody. I am getting a little bit of a warning that I've got a low bandwidth, so I hope that I'm coming through okay for you. And I'll just try to talk fast while I've got the good connection. I put a couple of things in the chat.
Oh no, you're
Oops.
muted.
Oh. Are you muted?
Yeah.
I sure am.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to try. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Sorry, everybody. You'd think this is the first time I've done this. put a couple of things in the chat for you related to Perpich Center for Arts Education. Our Perpich Arts High School has our admissions deadline coming up next Monday. So we've been working toward this for the last several months, trying to get the word out to students across the state about this arts high school experience and if this is the right fit for them. So that admissions deadline is February 1st. I put a link in there for our virtual tour. I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's pretty fun, actually done by a company here in Golden Valley. And I'm blanking on their name, but that's okay. And then we also did have a virtual information session. So we were limited in the number of people we could bring on campus like we normally would to have information sessions and give them tours. So we created a virtual info session, and that link is there. We are celebrating right now our studio art students. The Regional Scholastic Art Awards just came out, and Perpich had 73 of our 144 students submit artwork, and 94 awards were received by those 73 students. So that puts Perpich in the top 3 of schools in the state of Minnesota for the number of awards we received. So we're really proud of all of that incredible work, especially in these times. One of the things that we continue to say at Perpich is that creativity continues. Even in the pandemic, our students are still finding ways to be creative and to, do their art and do it really well. So we're very proud. And I think I can transition to Rotary now. Gary, if you would like me to do that.
Yeah, go right ahead. I was going to ask
Gary,
Betsy,
I think it's frozen for
Peggy,
me.
if Peggy's,
Okay.
Peggy's got anything to add, she can chime in on the Rotary too.
Yes, perfect.
Oh.
So my connection is unstable. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can see and hear you.
It's telling, beautiful, thank you. It's telling me my connection is unstable. What does it know? Every month, our Rotary Club volunteers at Prism, and you all have an open invitation to join us. I just put the Sign Up Genius link in the chat. The next opportunity to volunteer is next Thursday, February 4th. Yes. And Prism right now is in a diaper drive. They need diapers. And one of the projects that we'll be doing next Thursday is actually taking diapers, large chunks of diapers, and packaging them in 10-piece packs so that they can easily be distributed to families. So you are welcome to join us. It's all very social distance, it's masked, it's safe, and we would love to have the extra hands.
Great. Hey, anything, Peggy, that you have to add about the Rotary?
Not really. I think Betsy's kind of covered it. We have speakers lined up now through mid-March. Just signed up another one yesterday, so I'm thrilled.
Great. Excellent.
And I have to toot Peggy's horn here, because Peggy is our speaker coordinator. She gets an incredible lineup of speakers. I'm going to also pop into the chat a link to our calendar for the Rotary. It's not fully updated. I will get that done soon, but at least the next couple of weeks are on there so that you can look and see if anything's of interest and join us. It's all virtual right now. You are more than welcome to join us.
Okay, great. Thank you. Brent, any chamber updates, news, action?
Yeah, a few things. I'll just start with some process pieces. So apologize for some of the craziness on the Zoom meeting. First time I was involved with the Zoom bombing thing, and we'll work on some of that. But along the lines of the speaker opportunities, please think of that for these business councils as well, and forward those on as we try to tighten up some of the process stuff, and we'll get there. The other piece on chamber, we have our regional annual meeting, a virtual meeting, although it's being the participants are participating live on stage this afternoon from 3:30 to 5 at First Avenue, but then for people who are viewing it, it's remote. So that'll be an interesting little experiment. I think more directly to the group here and West Metro in particular, kind of legacy from Twin West on the report to the community is next month. The Wednesday before the Golden Valley Business Council meeting is scheduled. What is that? The 24th. So look for that. I'll get some more information out about that as well. And then finally, we've started some task forces around work, the strategic work that we're doing with this relatively new merger of Twin West and the Regional Chamber and other entities that are under the regional umbrella. Michelle Swanson, who's on the call, chairs the Economic and Community Initiatives group, which will really be the linchpin in terms of what we're doing around kind of suburban representation and engagement. So if you have ideas, concerns, whatever, shoot them my way. Happy to kind of get more involved there. And I believe Al Swintek, who's on the call, is also on one of those task forces, I think the policy advocacy group. But I don't want to obviously speak for him or that group because I'm not involved with it. But
No, that's true.
huh?
It is true.
Oh, it is true. Okay, good to know. Nobody better than Al on that group. So glad to hear it.
Okay. Any other announcements? None? Well, we can have introductions now if everybody wants it, but I think we, but there's no other announcements, or we can adjourn. What would everybody prefer? I guess we're ready to adjourn. I don't see anybody excited about announcements. Our next meeting, I'm just checking my calendar here to make sure I got February up, is going to be the 25th. Woohoo! The 25th of February. That happens to be a big day for me. Anyway, so we will see there. It's my birthday. Yeah, how about that? So, anyway, we will see everybody here, same time, 8:30 on February 25th. And everybody have a great month in between then. And thank you for participating in our first Golden Valley Business Council for the year. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye now.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye now.